The weight of 1,000 years settled in the dust motes that danced in the slivers of moonlight, piercing the high, arched windows of his throne room. Nikolai sat not on the throne of obsidian and cold iron, but on the steps leading up to it, his long frame folded into an arrangement of limbs that spoke of an exhaustion bone-deep, soul-deep. He had not drawn a breath in 4 minutes. There was no need. The air in this room had not changed in decades, the same stone dust, the same faint iron tang from the throne's cold metal, the same absence of anything living. The crown was a phantom weight on his brow, an echo of a pressure he hadn't physically felt in a century. Yet its burden was the only constant in a life that had unspooled across ages. He was a king of shadows and silence, his kingdom a tapestry of fear woven with threads of grudging respect. His name was a word used to frighten children and chasten rebellious lords. Nikolai, the Ancient, the Unsleeping. The name was a fortress, and he had lived within its walls for so long he'd forgotten the man who existed before it. A moth landed on his knee. He watched it with the focused attention of someone who had exhausted every other form of entertainment available to an immortal. The moth flexed its wings. He could hear the faint papery rasp of them, could smell the dust of its scales. He could, if he chose, count its heartbeats. He chose not to. Even he had standards. For weeks, whispers had slithered into his court from the southern forests, tales of a village called Oakhaven, plagued by something that left livestock savaged and folk too frightened to walk the woods after dusk. A minor disturbance, a gnat at the edge of his vast domain. His lieutenant Vasek had offered to handle it with the enthusiasm of someone who desperately wanted to be useful, and the competence of someone who would almost certainly make it worse. Nikolai decided, in a moment of sheer, unadulterated ennui, to go himself. It was not heroism. It was the immortal equivalent of getting off the couch because you'd already stared at the ceiling for 3 centuries. He traveled without heraldry, a tall shadow in a simple dark cloak, moving through the gloaming with a silence that was his birthright. The forest floor was soft beneath his boots' moss, fallen leaves, the damp mineral smell of earth after rain. He catalogued each scent automatically, the way a human might note passing street signs. Fox, 12 minutes old. Deer, a doe, southward. Wood smoke, human settlement, half a league east. He found the source of the trouble easily enough. A crag wolf, larger than any natural beast, its eyes burning with a feverish, unnatural light, the telltale sign of corrupted magic. Some hedge sorcerer's experiment gone feral, most likely. To a mortal village, it was a nightmare. To Nikolai, it was a moderately interesting inconvenience. The fight was brief, a blur of shadow and claw. He broke its neck with a contemptuous snap, the sound swallowed by the ancient woods. It was in the aftermath, as he stood over the cooling carcass, feeling nothing in particular, that he misjudged the treacherous, rain-slicked rock beneath his feet. He fell not with the grace of his kind, but with the clumsy finality of a mortal. His arm struck a jagged edge of stone, and while the bone did not break, the flesh tore deep. He looked at the gash, at the slow, thick welling of his own dark blood, and felt a flicker of something akin to surprise. Pain was a novelty, a dull, distant thing he hadn't truly felt in centuries. He could feel the unnatural magic of the wolf's saliva already working against his healing, a sluggish poison that turned his normally instantaneous recovery into something tediously slow. The wound throbbed with a sullen heat that was, he had to admit, genuinely annoying. He needed supplies. Following a faint golden light that pulsed through the dense trees, he walked toward a cottage nestled in a small clearing. Wood smoke curled from its stone chimney. Light spilled from its windows, warm and buttery, an affront to the deep gloom of the forest. He could smell herbs drying, bread baking, and something else, the clean, vital scent of a human life lived without fear. Her heartbeat was steady and unhurried, 62 beats per minute. She was calm. He hesitated at the door, a creature of the dark poised on the threshold of a warm, bright place he had no business entering. The pain in his arm gave a sharp, insistent pulse. With a sigh that stirred the dead leaves at his feet, a sigh he didn't technically need to produce, since he didn't technically need to breathe, but 1,000 years of habit was 1,000 years of habit. He raised a hand and knocked. The door opened, and a woman stood there wiping her hands on an apron dusted with flour and what appeared to be crushed chamomile. She was not a classic beauty, not the kind whose faces were immortalized in the tapestries lining his cold castle walls. Her face was a landscape of character, strong cheekbones, a dusting of freckles across her nose, and eyes the color of warm honey that regarded him with open, uncomplicated curiosity. Her brown hair was a chaotic braid tumbling over one shoulder, and there was a smudge of something green on her jaw that she clearly didn't know about. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was like her light, warm, clear, and utterly devoid of the tremor he was so accustomed to hearing from mortals in his presence. He gestured with his good hand toward his injured arm, the fabric of his sleeve dark and stiff with blood. "I require assistance. I had a disagreement with a wolf." Her eyes widened not in fear, but in the specific, focused concern of a professional encountering her area of expertise. "A crag wolf? They've been mad lately. Come in, come in. Don't stand there bleeding on my doorstep." She stepped aside, holding the door wider. "It's a terrible habit. The bleeding, not the standing. Although the standing is also unnecessary." Nikolai stepped across the threshold, and the warmth of the small cottage hit him like a wall. It was a physical shock, not painful, but overwhelming. The air was dense with life. Lavender, chamomile, yeast, wood smoke. Bunches of herbs hung from the rafters like an inverted garden. A fat ginger cat blinked at him from a mantelpiece cluttered with clay pots and smooth stones, radiating the supreme indifference that only a cat in full possession of the best seat in the house can achieve. He could hear everything: the crackle of the fire, the settling of the floorboards, the cat's slow, contented heartbeat. Maya's quicker now, 68 beats per minute. She was interested, not afraid. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth. He obeyed without thinking. A king of 1,000 years, commander of legions, sat down because a mortal woman with flour on her apron pointed at a chair. He filed this information away for later analysis. "Let me see it." She took his wrist, her fingers surprisingly strong, her grip firm and sure against his skin. He watched her brow furrow, then smooth, then furrow again. "You're cold," she noted, but she said it the way she might note the weather. Observation, not accusation. "I run cold," he said, which was true, in the same way the ocean ran wet. "Gods, you really did a number on it." She cut away the sleeve with a small, sharp knife, her movements efficient and practiced. "Hold still. This will sting." She cleansed the wound with a cloth soaked in something that smelled of sharp alcohol and astringent herbs. It did sting, a clean, biting fire that made his muscles tense involuntarily. He watched her face, illuminated by the firelight. She was completely absorbed in her work, her expression a mixture of concentration and quiet compassion. She did not seem to notice the unnatural stillness of his chest, the absence of breath fog in the cool room, or the fact that his pupils did not contract in the firelight the way a human's would. Or perhaps she noticed all of it and simply didn't care. He wasn't sure which possibility was more unsettling. "You're a stoic one," she said, glancing up at him with a small, testing smile. "Most men would be howling by now." "I have a high tolerance for pain," he said. You also have a high tolerance for dramatic cloaks." She began stitching the wound with a neat, practiced rhythm, her head bent close to his arm. He could see the fine strands of hair that had escaped her braid. He could smell the soap she used, sage and something floral. Beneath that, her own scent, warm skin, bread yeast, a sharp green note of crushed herbs embedded in her fingertips. Every healer he had ever known across the centuries had carried some version of this scent, but on her it was specific and singular, and he found that his attention kept returning to it when he tried to direct it elsewhere. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice sounding strange in the small, bright room. "Rusty." "Maya," she said, not looking up. "And you are?" He hesitated a beat too long. 1,000 names, 1,000 titles. He chose the most hollow, the most distant. Nikolai. "Well, Nikolai," she said, tying off the final stitch with a deft pull, "you have a tendency toward the dramatic, don't you? A midnight brawl with a wolf? A cloak that looks like it's seen better centuries. A name that sounds like it belongs in a history book." She began wrapping his arm in clean linen, her hands gentle now. "You should be more careful. The forest doesn't suffer fools gladly." He stared at her. She was chiding him. Her, a mortal healer in a forgotten village, was chiding him. The lord of a kingdom that stretched from the northern wastes to the southern sea. A sound threatened to escape his chest, something perilously close to a laugh. He suppressed it with the same iron control he applied to his hunger. The sensation was terrifying. She finished her work, patting the bandage lightly. "There. I'll give you a salve to draw out any lingering poison." She finally looked up, her brown eyes meeting his directly, and for the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not fear. Something quieter. She was seeing the strangeness of him, the absolute stillness of his chest, the cool, pale skin, the eyes that were perhaps a shade too focused, a shade too old for the face that held them. "You're not from around here," she stated. "No," he said. It was the truest thing he had told her. "You have very old eyes, Nikolai," she said softly, her gaze steady on his. Her heartbeat ticked up 74 now, but her voice didn't waver. And in that moment, under the gentle scrutiny of a mortal woman in a warm, bright cottage, the king of 1,000 years felt something he had not felt since he was a boy with a beating heart. He felt seen, and it was the most profound terror he had ever known. Nikolai returned to the cold grandeur of his fortress, and the silence that had once been a comfort now rang like a bell. The deference of his court, the averted eyes, the hushed tones, the way servants pressed themselves against walls as he passed, was suddenly grating in a way it hadn't been in 500 years. He stood in his private chambers, unwinding the bandage from his arm. Beneath it, the flesh was already smooth, unmarked, not even a whisper of a scar. The wolf's magic had delayed his healing by perhaps 6 hours. Maya's stitching had been meticulous, a kindness rendered entirely unnecessary by a biology she didn't know existed. He should have discarded the bandage. Instead, he set it on the edge of his desk and looked at it for a long time. The linen still smelled faintly of sage. He told himself the matter was concluded. A minor wound, a minor kindness, a mortal woman who'd been practical and brave and entirely unafraid of him, which was novel but not significant. He had met brave mortals before. They were brave, and then they were dust. 6 days passed, 6 identical cycles of moon and stars. Nikolai sat through 3 council meetings he did not remember afterward. He read 40 pages of a manuscript on territorial water rights and absorbed none of them. He stood at the window of his library for 2 hours one evening, watching the southern sky, and only realized he was doing it when Vasek cleared his throat from the doorway and asked if the king required anything. "No," Nikolai said, too quickly. On the 7th night, he went back. He wore the same cloak. He told himself this was because it was practical, not because she had mocked it, and he wanted to see if she would do it again. He didn't approach immediately. He stood at the edge of the clearing, wrapped in shadow, and watched. Maya was in her garden, kneeling in the dirt in the late amber light, her hands deep in the soil. She was talking to her plants. He could hear every word with crystal clarity from 50 yards away. "If you die on me, I will be personally offended," she informed a struggling rosemary bush. "I have given you excellent soil. I have given you adequate drainage. I have given you a pep talk, which is more than most rosemary gets. Do your job." Something in Nikolai's chest did a thing he didn't have a name for. He emerged from the trees, making slightly more noise than was natural for him, he had learned, across centuries, that appearing silently behind humans tended to cause cardiac events, and she looked up. A genuine smile broke across her face, quick and unrehearsed. "Nikolai," she said, pleased, "I was wondering if you'd survived my stitching." "Let me see." He held out his arm. She unwrapped the bandage and ran her thumb over the skin where the wound had been. Smooth, pale, completely unmarked. Her thumbs stopped. She looked up at him, her gaze sharp and measuring. He could feel the question forming. "You heal fast," she said. "Very fast. This should have scarred. I have a resilient constitution." She regarded him for a moment. He could hear her heartbeat steady, assessing 70 beats per minute. She was deciding whether to push. She decided not to. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or disappointed. "Come inside. I have stew on the fire and you look like you haven't eaten in." She paused, eyeing him. "Honestly, I can't tell. You look like you've never eaten. Has anyone ever told you that you're unreasonably pale? It has been mentioned. Have you considered sunlight?" He almost laughed. "I am not well suited to sunlight." She led him inside. A bowl of thick, rich stew was placed before him at her small wooden table. He had not eaten mortal food in 500 years. The act felt archaeological, an excavation of a self that had been buried under centuries of dust. He lifted the spoon. The first bite was a catastrophe. His body, which had processed nothing but blood for 500 years, seized around the food like a mechanism encountering a foreign object. He felt his throat resist, felt the strange, almost forgotten work of swallowing something that was not liquid, not blood, not the thing his body actually wanted. For a moment, he thought he might have to excuse himself. Then the flavor arrived, rich, herbed, deeply savory, and his body, with the grudging compliance of a machine remembering an old function, accepted it. The second spoonful went down easier. By the third, he felt a brief, irrational fury at having missed 5 centuries of stew. He ate, and he listened. Maya talked about the village, the stubbornness of the mayor, who had once argued with a fence post and lost, the kindness of the blacksmith's wife, who left bread on doorsteps but would deny it to her grave. She talked about her herbs, the delicate negotiations between soil and water and light. He found himself watching her hands. They never stopped moving, illustrating a point, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, reaching for the bread, adjusting the angle of a clay pot on the windowsill. She was a creature of constant, purposeful motion. She was the opposite of everything he was. "You are very quiet," she noted, tilting her head. "I listen well. You listen well, but you don't speak of yourself. Everyone has something to tell, Nikolai." She leaned forward. "You think the world is a dangerous place, don't you? That's what I see in your eyes. A great and terrible caution." His hand, resting on the table, went very still. Not human still, the deeper stillness, the kind that made the air around him seem to thicken. He saw her notice it, a tiny flicker in her eyes, there and gone. "The world is a dangerous place," he said, his voice lower than he intended. "It is filled with treachery and loss. To be incautious is to be a fool." "Or it's to be alive," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Caution is a shield, Nikolai. But you can hold a shield so tightly, you forget how to hold anything else." He had no answer for that. He had commanded armies, counseled kings before they were dust, and rewritten the maps of nations. And he was being undone by metaphors about gardening from a woman with dirt under her fingernails. The impulse to smile was so foreign that his face didn't entirely know how to comply. It must have shown, though, because she said, "Was that almost a smile? Was the great and mysterious Nikolai almost smiling?" "Certainly not." "It was. I saw it. One corner went up. That counts." He stayed for 2 hours. When he finally rose to leave, a reluctance he did not understand held him at the door. The cool night air pressed against his back. The warm light of her cottage pulled at his front. He stood precisely on the threshold, which felt in a way he refused to examine, like a metaphor. "Thank you for the meal, Maya," he said, the formal words feeling thin. "Come back when you're not bleeding," she said with a smile. "It's much more pleasant." He stepped into the darkness. Her heartbeat receded behind him, steady and unconcerned. 62 beats per minute. She was not afraid. She had never, in 2 encounters, been afraid. He walked into the forest, and for the first time in a very long time, the dark felt less like a home and more like an absence. The third visit was a disaster, in the sense that it destroyed something fundamental about his self-conception, which was worse than any military defeat. He arrived at dusk. She was at her work table, grinding dried valerian with a mortar and pestle, and she looked up with a smile that had already become dangerously familiar. "Nikolai, I was starting to think you only showed up for the stew." The stew was a contributing factor, he admitted, and was rewarded with a laugh, genuine, unself-conscious, a sound that seemed to fill the cottage with something brighter than lamplight. She put the kettle on and made tea. He accepted a cup and held it between his hands, where the heat slowly leached into his cold fingers. She noticed. "Your hands," she said, reaching across the table to touch one. Her fingers were rough with work, warm, alive. The contact sent a current through him that had nothing to do with temperature. "You're always cold, not just cool cold, like you've been outside for hours. I told you, I run cold. And I told you that's not an explanation, it's a description." She held his hand for a moment, her thumb pressing against his wrist, where a human's pulse would be. Her expression didn't change, but her heartbeat picked up. 75, 80. She felt the absence. She released his hand casually, reached for the sugar, and said nothing. She knew something was wrong. She was choosing not to ask. The discipline of that, the respect of it, was more disarming than any confrontation. But he had seen her face in the moment her thumb found silence where a heartbeat should have been. He had watched a healer, a woman whose entire existence was built on the rhythms of living bodies, encounter the absence of that rhythm and choose, with quiet deliberation, to pour more tea. She had weighed the evidence, the cold skin, the impossible healing, the pulse that wasn't there, and she had decided that whatever he was mattered less than who he was. He wasn't sure she knew she'd made that decision yet, but he knew, and it terrified him more than anything 1,000 years of war had offered. He told her, that evening, about a desert he had crossed as a young man. He spoke of it as a memory from a book, distant and abstracted, but the details were too specific, too sensory, the way the sand had smelled at dawn, the color of the light shifting from violet to copper, the terrible silence of a landscape that had been old before human memory. She listened with the focused stillness of someone who was hearing more than the words. "That's beautiful," she said quietly. "You describe it like you were there." He said nothing. His hand on the table was perfectly, inhumanly still. She looked at it, looked at him. The fire crackled. "More tea?" she asked brightly, and got up to fill the kettle. Her back was turned to him, her hands busy, and he could hear her heartbeat, 88 beats per minute. She was shaken, but she poured the tea with steady hands and set it before him, and smiled. That was the night he realized he was in trouble. The 5th visit. He had stopped counting by accident, which was itself alarming. He, who could recall the precise date of every significant event across 10 centuries, was losing track of which Tuesday it was because his weeks had reoriented themselves around the evenings he spent in a healer's cottage. It was a cold autumn evening, rain lashing against the windows, the fire throwing unsteady shadows. They sat in the 2 chairs by the hearth chairs that had developed a territorial significance, his and hers, in a way that made something in his chest tighten every time he sat down. Maya was telling him about her grandmother, a woman who had apparently terrified the entire village into good health through sheer force of personality. "She used to say every living thing has its own song," Maya said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. The song of willow is different from the song of oak. The song of a person is the most complicated of all. It changes with joy and grief." "And what is my song?" The question escaped before he could cage it. He heard himself ask it and felt the unfamiliar, sickening sensation of having revealed something he hadn't intended to. His body went still. Not the performative stillness of sitting quietly, but the real thing, the absence of breath, of fidget, of the micro movements that made a living person look alive. The fire popped, and he didn't flinch. Maya grew quiet, studying him. The firelight moved across her face, but she was perfectly focused, her eyes narrowing slightly in the way they did when she was diagnosing something. "Your song," she said slowly, "is very old. It sounds like stone and wind and deep, quiet water." A pause. "It's a sad song, Nikolai, but I don't think it was always sad." Something cracked. Not loudly, not a dramatic fracture, not the shattering of ancient defenses in a single blow. More like a fissure in ice, hairline thin, through which something warm and agonizing began to seep. He looked down at his hands, which were gripping the arms of the chair hard enough to dent the wood. He released the chair. The dents remained. She looked at them, looked at him. "More tea?" she asked. Her voice was gentle. Her hands were already reaching for the kettle. Her eyes were bright with something she was choosing not to name. "Please," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which was a thing that had not happened to him in 400 years. The catalyst came 11 days later. He had lingered too long after a visit, walking the darkened path back to the deep woods, when he heard a cry. A boy from the village cornered by a pair of feral hounds, their eyes burning with the same corrupted magic as the crag wolf. Nikolai didn't think. He moved. The distance between himself and the boy, 40 yards of broken ground and underbrush, vanished in a heartbeat. He was there, between the boy and the hounds, and the creatures were dead before the boy had finished drawing his next breath. The boy stared up at him, small face, white as paper, eyes stretched wide. Not with gratitude, with the pure, comprehending terror of a child who had just seen something that could not be possible. "You are safe," Nikolai said, his voice a low command. "Go home." The boy scrambled to his feet and fled. Nikolai watched him go, a cold dread seeping through him. The boy had seen. He had seen a man move faster than sight, had watched something inhuman wearing a human face, and children talked. He went to Maya's cottage the next night with the intention of saying goodbye. He would manufacture a reason. He would rip the warmth of her presence from his life and return to the cold safety of solitude. It was the only way to protect her. She was waiting on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders. She was not smiling. In her hands, she held a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "Thomas came to me this morning," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "He told me a story about a dark angel who moved faster than the wind. He said the angel dropped this." She held up the bird. "He wanted me to return it." The silence between them was vast and occupied. His hand went to his pocket empty. The bird had been there for centuries, a small token from a market in a city that no longer existed. "Who are you, Nikolai?" she asked. Not accusation, not fear. Something deeper, a sorrow at having been kept outside, a truth she had already half seen. He had rehearsed lies. Dozens of them. They dissolved. "I am the one who rules these lands," he said, stripping his voice of all warmth, layering it with the cold authority of ages. "The one whose name is used to frighten children into obedience. I am the monster in the dark, Maya." He waited for the recoil, the scream, the slamming door. He braced for the loss the way he had braced for every loss across 1,000 years, by going still, by becoming stone, by preparing to endure. The color left her cheeks. Her eyes went wide with the weight of comprehension. Her heartbeat spiked 130, 140, and her hands, those steady, competent hands that had never once trembled while stitching a wound, began to shake. She pressed them against her thighs. She was afraid. For the first time since he had known her, she was genuinely, physically afraid. And then she breathed. One long, deliberate inhale. One slow exhale. He watched her master the fear, not dismiss it, not pretended away, but take it in her hands the way she took everything and decide what to do with it. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, then another. She stopped directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, close enough to hear her heartbeat fast now, 110, but driving forward, not fleeing. She looked up into his face. "All this time," she whispered, "you must have been so lonely." And then she laid her hand against his cheek, her warm palm against his cold skin, the contrast so sharp it felt like touching flame. He flinched, not from pain, from the sheer, overwhelming fact that he had offered her the worst of himself, and she had answered with compassion. His eyes closed, his hand came up, slowly, and covered hers. He held it there. He could feel her pulse through her palm, quick and steady and alive, so alive, beating against his cold skin like a small, fierce drum. "Yes," he said. It was the first entirely honest thing he had ever told another person. His voice cracked on the word, and he let it. The revelation rebuilt everything between them. Not quickly, not in a single conversation or a dramatic scene. Slowly, awkwardly, with the halting uncertainty of two people learning a new language, the first conversation after his confession lasted until dawn. They sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets, she in wool. He in the kind of deep shadow that the porch overhang provided, while the sky shifted from black to indigo to the first dangerous blush of pink. "So you're actually immortal," she said, for the third time, as if repetition might make the word behave more sensibly. Not metaphorically, not "I age slowly," actually immortal. "Yes." And the cold skin, a consequence of my condition, and the not breathing. "I do breathe, occasionally, out of habit." "Out of habit," she stared at him. "You breathe out of habit, the way someone might bite their nails. I would argue it is a somewhat more sophisticated habit than nail biting." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her heartbeat still elevated, still processing, but not panicked. The quality of the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of things unsaid. It was the silence of someone rearranging their understanding of the world. "The stew," she said suddenly. "What about the stew?" "You ate my stew. You hadn't eaten mortal food in 500 years, and you ate my stew and didn't say anything." "It was very good stew." "Nikolai, was it actually good, or were you just being polite? Because if a 500-year-old vampire was just being polite about my stew, I need to know." "It was genuinely good," he said, and for the first time since his confession, something that was not dread or terror loosened in his chest. It was, in fact, unreasonably good. I was angry about it. "You were angry about my stew." "I was angry about having missed 500 years of stew." She burst out laughing. The sound carried across the clearing and startled a bird from the trees. She laughed until she was wiping her eyes, and when the laughter subsided, something quieter took its place. "I checked your pulse," she said. Her voice was soft, her eyes on the lightening sky. "The third time you came to the cottage. I held your wrist while I was pretending to check that the tea had steeped. There was nothing, no heartbeat, just cold skin and silence." He went very still. "You knew, since the third visit." "I knew something. I didn't know the word for it. I didn't need the word." She looked at him, and her expression was open in a way that stripped every defense he had left. "I needed to know whether you were kind, and you were. You ate my stew with the expression of a man who was remembering what it meant to be alive. That was enough for me." "You should have been afraid," he said. "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid you'd stop coming back." The simplicity of it undid him. 1,000 years of hiding, of performing, of maintaining the careful fiction of being something other than what he was, and she had seen through it on the third visit and decided it didn't matter. She had planted moonflowers for him. She had poured him tea and checked his pulse and found nothing, and chosen him anyway, not despite what he was, but in full, quiet knowledge of it. He sat there in the dark, in the shadow of her porch, and he thought, "I am in very serious trouble. The question of Thomas hung between them. "The boy," Nikolai said, during that long dawn conversation. "He saw what I am." "He saw a stranger save his life," Maya said firmly. "I've already talked to him, and to his mother." Thomas believes he saw something magical and wonderful, and his mother believes he had a bad fright in the dark and Maya's strange friend happened to be passing by. People believe what they can live with, Nikolai. The village knows you're different. They don't need to know the word for it. It was, he reflected, the most practically wise approach to supernatural exposure management he had ever encountered, and she had handled it before he'd even thought to ask. He began visiting openly. The villagers, who had only known their king as a distant, terrifying legend, were struck dumb. They would see him walking beside their healer in her garden as dusk fell, a tall, dark figure whose stillness seemed to absorb the fading light, whose skin was too pale, who never ate at the village gatherings Maya dragged him to, but who would stand beside her with his hands behind his back, watching the proceedings with an expression of faintly bewildered tolerance. "You could try smiling," Maya suggested once, after a village elder had backed into a fence trying to bow and walk away simultaneously. "I am smiling." "No, you are doing something with your face that you think is smiling. It is not. It is the expression of someone who is considering whether to annex this territory. I already own this territory. And yet you cannot locate the sugar bowl in my kitchen." He brought her to the castle. The first time she walked through its massive gates, she did not gasp at the Gothic grandeur or shrink from the oppressive silence. She looked around the cavernous entry hall, at the vaulted ceilings and the cold stone and the suits of armor standing at attention, and said, "It's very large and very clean. Who does the dusting?" "Because this is a genuinely unreasonable amount of surface area." He showed her the library, his sanctuary, a vast circular room, lined from floor to ceiling with books and scrolls collected over a millennium. The air smelled of old paper and leather, and the faint mineral tang of the stone walls. It was cold. Everything in his world was cold. "This," she whispered, running her fingers along the spines, "is the most beautiful place I have ever seen." And there it was again, the fissure in the ice, widening. He watched her move through his most private space, as if she belonged there, her warm hands trailing across his cold, ancient things, leaving traces of heat that he could detect for hours afterward. She left fingerprints in the dust on a 14th century manuscript, and he did not wipe them away. They developed a rhythm. Some nights he came to her cottage, folding himself into the wooden chair by her fire while she worked, his cold presence a counterpoint to the room's warmth. Other nights she came to the castle, curling up in an armchair in his library with a book, while he dealt with matters of state at his desk. The quiet companionship was a thing he had never experienced, another person simply existing in his space, breathing, turning pages, occasionally interrupting to read him a passage she found interesting. "Listen to this," she said one evening, not looking up from her book. "This poet says the night is a velvet shroud upon the weeping earth. What do you think?" "I think the night is the period during which I can go outside without catching fire. The poet's mileage may vary." She looked up. She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she burst out laughing, helpless, gasping laughter that bent her forward in the chair, and the sound was so unexpected and so alive in this dead, silent room that something in Nikolai's chest lurched like a rusted mechanism trying to turn. He could hear the night settling outside, an owl, the distant movement of a deer, wind in the ancient pines. And inside, her laughter, which was the most foreign sound these walls had ever contained. She recovered, wiping her eyes, and pointed at his desk. "What are you working on? You've been staring at that same page for 20 minutes. I can tell because you haven't turned it. Trade negotiations with the eastern provinces. That sounds dreadful." "It is dreadful. It has been dreadful for 300 years. The eastern provinces are constitutionally incapable of agreeing on tariff rates. I have watched entire dynasties rise and fall without resolving Clause 7. She set her book down and came to stand behind his chair. peering over his shoulder at the documents. She smelled of the chamomile tea she'd been drinking and the wood smoke from his own fireplace. Her proximity was a specific, localized catastrophe that he was managing through sheer force of will. "This handwriting is beautiful," she said, touching the edge of a letter. "But this signature is this from Lord Corvin?" "It is. It looks like a spider fell in an inkwell and tried to escape. Are you sure he can actually read?" "I have suspected for some time that he cannot." She laughed again, shorter this time, and her hand landed briefly on his shoulder as she straightened. The touch was casual, the kind of contact a person made without thinking, without assigning weight to it. He catalogued the exact pressure and placement of each finger. He noted that the warmth of her palm remained detectable on his shoulder for 11 seconds after she withdrew it. This was becoming a problem. Another night, she discovered his collection of maps, centuries of cartography, charts of coastlines that had long since shifted, cities whose names had changed 4 times. She spread them across the library floor and crouched over them with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. "This city doesn't exist anymore," she said, tracing a coastline with her finger. "No." He was standing by the window, arms crossed, watching her. He didn't breathe. When she was absorbed in something and not looking at him, it was easier to drop the performance. No breath, no fidget, no blinking. Just absolute stillness and the luxury of watching her exist. "You said you crossed a desert once. Is this the one?" She held up a map from the 14th century, hand-drawn, the desert rendered in pale gold ink. He came to stand beside her. The map was 800 years old. It had been drawn by a man named Samir who had traveled with him for 3 years and died of a fever outside Constantinople. Nikolai hadn't thought about Samir in 2 centuries. "Yes," he said, "that is the one." She looked at the map, then at him. Her expression was quiet, open, holding a question she still hadn't asked. The question about how he could speak of 800-year-old memories as if he'd lived them. Her heartbeat was steady. She was patient. She would wait until he was ready. He wanted, suddenly and desperately, to tell her everything. The impulse was so strong it frightened him. He stepped back. His hand found the edge of the desk and gripped it. The wood creaked. "It's late," he said. "I should escort you back to the village." "It is late," she agreed, carefully rolling up the map. "But Nikolai, you don't have to escort me. I've been walking those woods alone for 30 years. Humor me. I seem to do that a great deal." They walked together through the castle corridors, his boots silent on the stone, hers making soft, human sounds. He shortened his stride to match hers. He walked on the side closest to the windows, where cold air leaked in. She walked on the inner side, near the walls that retained some heat from the fireplaces. He had arranged this without thinking about it, putting himself between her and the cold, the way he put himself between her and everything. One evening, he arrived at her cottage and found something new in the garden. Where the rosemary still struggled and the chamomile still argued about drainage, a small patch of moonflowers had appeared, white blooms that opened only at dusk, their petals unfurling in the failing light like small, pale hands reaching for the dark. "Those are new," he said. "I planted them last week." She didn't look up from the herbs she was bundling. "They bloom at night. I thought it seemed right. To have something beautiful that only comes alive in the dark." She said it casually, as if it were about botany. But her heartbeat was 82, slightly elevated, and he understood what she had done. She had planted something in her garden that bloomed on his schedule. She had rearranged a small corner of her living, sunlit world to include a man who could not stand in sunlight. He stood there, in the shadow of her cottage, surrounded by flowers that had been planted for him, and the understanding hit him with the force of something physical. This is what it looks like when someone loves you. Not the grand, desperate, consuming love of the old stories, the kind that burned empires and launched wars. Something quieter. Someone planting flowers that bloom in the dark because that's when you come to visit. He did not say it. He was not ready. But the moonflowers glowed white in the dusk, and she smiled when she saw him notice them. And the fissure in the ice became something that could no longer be called a fissure. It was an opening, and he was no longer certain he wanted to close it. The first time he noticed, they were sitting on the balcony overlooking the castle grounds. She was talking about a patient who had stubbornly refused to take his medicine. Moonlight caught her face, silvering the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. She was 32. He knew the exact architecture of her face, every freckle, every expression, the way her mouth moved when she was being sarcastic versus when she was being kind. He had been studying it with the obsessive attention of someone who suspected the subject might disappear. And there, in the moonlight, he could see the future mapped across her skin, how these lines would deepen, how the quick brightness of her eyes would eventually soften, how time, that relentless, grinding thing that had no dominion over him, would slowly, gently, inexorably reshape her. He would be exactly the same. 1,000 years from now, if he survived that long, he would look precisely as he looked tonight, and she would be a memory. His hand tightened on the stone railing. The granite cracked faintly under his fingers. "Nikolai?" Her voice. Concerned, present, alive. "Yes." "You went somewhere." She was watching him with the diagnostic focus she brought to everything. "You do that sometimes. You look at me and then you're not here anymore. Where do you go?" He looked at her. He looked at the fine silver thread at her temple that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. He looked at her hands, strong and brown and alive, and thought about those hands going still. "Nowhere," he said. "I am right here." She didn't press. But later that evening, when she reached for his hand as they walked back through the castle corridors, she held it a little tighter than usual. Her heartbeat was steady. She knew. She didn't know the specifics, not yet, but she knew the shape of what he carried. She held his cold hand in her warm one and said nothing. He let her. He stopped visiting. The decision was not sudden. It was the slow, grinding conclusion of a calculation he had been running since the night on the balcony. The arithmetic of watching her age. The compound interest of grief accumulating across every remaining year of her life. He had survived plagues, wars, the collapse of empires. He was not certain he could survive watching the light leave Maya's eyes. So he stayed in his fortress. He sat in his library, where her fingerprints were still visible in the dust of the 14th century manuscript, and he did not wipe them away, and he did not go to her. 3 days passed, then 5, then 8. He stopped feeding, not consciously. At first he simply forgot, the way one forgets to wind a clock when the hours have lost their meaning. The stored blood in the castle cellars went untouched. His steward brought a goblet to his desk on the 3rd evening, and Nikolai looked at it and felt nothing. The hunger was there, but it was muffled beneath something heavier, a grief so vast and anticipatory that it swallowed everything else. By the 6th day, Vasek noticed. His lieutenant stood in the doorway of the library, shifting his weight from foot to foot with the nervous energy of someone who wanted very much to speak and very much did not want to be killed for speaking. "My lord, you have not fed." "I'm not hungry." "My lord, with respect, you are always hungry. That is the nature of our kind. Leave me." Vasek left, but Nikolai caught the look, the quick, sharp assessment of a subordinate measuring how far his king had declined. The skin drawn tighter over the bones, the eyes darker, more hollowed. The stillness deeper than usual, not the stillness of power held in reserve, but the stillness of something winding down. He was aware, in a distant, clinical way, that he was starving himself. He was aware that this was not rational behavior. He was aware that 1,000 years of survival instinct was screaming at him to feed, to move, to do something other than sit in a dark room counting the days since he had last heard a heartbeat at 62 beats per minute. He sat in the dark and counted them anyway. Maya came on the 9th day. He heard her before he saw her, the sound of her boots on the castle's stone floors, quick and purposeful, accompanied by the horrified murmurs of servants who had never seen a mortal woman march through the king's private corridors as though she owned them. Her heartbeat was elevated, 95, not afraid, angry. The library door opened without a knock. She stood in the doorway, her braid half undone, her cloak travel dusty, her face flushed from the cold walk up the mountain. She was carrying a basket because of course she was, because Maya approached every crisis with practical provisions, and she set it down on the nearest table with a thud that echoed through the vast, silent room. Then she looked at him. He saw the moment her anger converted to something else. Her eyes moved across his face, the hollowed cheeks, the shadows beneath his eyes that had deepened from faint suggestions to bruised crescents, the way his hands lay too still on the desk, fingers not even twitching. She was diagnosing him. He could see her clinical mind working, cataloging symptoms, cross-referencing against what she knew of his nature. "When did you last feed?" Her voice was level, the healer's voice. "It is not your concern." "When, Nikolai?" He said nothing. His silence was its own answer. She crossed the room and stood directly in front of his desk. She placed both hands flat on the wood and leaned forward. Her warmth reached him, that maddening, specific warmth that smelled of sage and bread yeast and chamomile, and the hunger stirred, dull and aching, beneath the weight of everything else. 8 days, she said. "I haven't seen you in 8 days. No visit, no message, no dramatic appearance at the edge of my garden. The man who couldn't go 7 days without showing up at my door has been absent for 8. And now I find you sitting in a dark room looking like something the cat wouldn't bother dragging in." "Maya, don't." She held up a hand. "Before you say whatever noble, self-sacrificing, monumentally stupid thing you've been rehearsing, I want you to know that I walked 4 hours in the dark to get here. I left a patient with a broken wrist in the care of her very nervous husband. I told the ginger cat to fend for himself, which he will not appreciate. So whatever you're about to say had better be worth it." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, at the silver thread in her hair that had been the start of all of this, at the freckles across her nose and the smudge of something green on her jaw, always something green on her jaw, and he felt the words rising like bile, bitter and necessary. "I am leaving," he said. "Not the kingdom, you. I am ending this." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full-packed, with the specific, terrible weight of a thing being broken. "Why?" One word. Quiet. Controlled. "Because I am watching you die." He stood, and the motion cost him a momentary unsteadiness that he corrected with the rigid discipline of a millennium. "Every time I look at you, I see the ending. The lines that will deepen, the hair that will turn, the heartbeat that will slow and falter and stop. And I will be exactly as I am now, unchanged, watching. For the rest of eternity, I will carry the memory of your face, aging into something I could not prevent. And I am not." His voice cracked. He turned away, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The wood groaned. "I am not strong enough," he said. "I have survived everything this world has offered, but I am not strong enough for this." She was quiet for a long time. He could hear her heartbeat 110 now, fast and hard, the rhythm of someone holding something enormous in check. When she spoke, her voice was low and shaking, not with fear, but with a fury so controlled it was almost surgical. "So, your solution," she said, "is to grieve me now, alone, in a dark room, without asking me what I want." "I am trying to protect." "No." The word was a blade. "You are trying to protect yourself. You're dressing it up as nobility, but what you're actually doing is choosing the pain you can control over the one you can't. And you are starving yourself while you do it, which is not strategic suffering, Nikolai. It is self-destruction with pretensions." He turned to face her. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, with the incandescent clarity of someone who had seen through every layer of his 1,000-year-old defenses and found the frightened thing underneath. Her hand shot out and grabbed a clay inkwell from his desk, a heavy, round thing that had sat there for 2 centuries, and she hurled it at the far wall, with the accuracy and conviction of a woman who had run out of patience with immortal cowardice. It shattered. Ink bloomed across the stone like a dark flower. "You do not get to decide this for me," she said. each word deliberate. You don't get to love me in secret and leave me for my own good. I'm not a child. I'm not fragile. I am a healer who has held dying people in her arms, and I chose you with my eyes open, and you owe me the respect of letting me keep choosing." He stared at her. Ink dripped down the wall behind her. Her chest was heaving. Her heartbeat was 130, furious and alive. And then his legs gave out. It was not dramatic, not a collapse, not a swoon. His body simply decided, with the implacable logic of a system running on nothing, that it was done. His knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of the desk, then slid sideways, his back against the wood, until he was sitting on the cold stone floor with his hands in his lap and his head tilted back against the desk's leg. "Nikolai." Her voice changed instantly, fury replaced by the sharp, focused urgency of a professional. She was beside him in a heartbeat, her hands on his face, tilting it toward the lamplight. Her fingers were warm against his skin, which was colder than she'd ever felt it. "How long?" she demanded. "How long since you fed? The truth." 12 days. His voice was thin. "Perhaps 14. I stopped counting." "You 14. She bit off the rest. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking his eyes, his pulse points finding nothing, of course, because there was never anything to find, then pressing her palm flat against his chest, feeling for the subtle vibration that told her his body was still functioning. "You're going into torpor," she said. Not a question. "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "I am sorry, Maya. I will be. Unreachable. Vulnerable." "Then sleep," she said, and her hand came to rest on his hair, and her voice cracked on the word, and the gesture was so tender that it was the last thing he felt before the dark took him. She guarded him through the night and the day that followed. While he lay in the healing torpor, that deep, unreachable sleep his body demanded, when the deprivation was severe, she sat beside him on the cold library floor. A mortal woman keeping watch over an ancient king who had tried to abandon her for her own good and had instead collapsed at her feet like a cautionary tale about the dangers of skipping meals. She had no sword, no supernatural senses. She had a sharp knife, a knowledge of every poisonous plant within reach, and the absolute immovable conviction that nothing was getting past her. She had also, at some point during the long hours, fashioned crude stakes from the legs of a broken chair she'd found in a storage room. The fact that she had no idea whether stakes actually worked on vampires and had made them anyway was, she suspected, exactly the kind of thing he would have an opinion about when he woke up. He woke at dusk. She was still there, cross-legged, her back straight, dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't slept. There was a small pile of sharpened chair legs beside her, arranged with the neatness of someone who needed to impose order on a situation that defied it. "You stayed," he said. His voice was a rasp. "Of course I stayed." She said it like he'd noted that the sky was above them. Then she looked at the pile of stakes and added, "I also made weapons. I don't know if they'd work on your kind, and I decided I didn't care. It was that or sit here feeling useless, and I don't do useless well. They would not work on my kind," he said. "Then it's a good thing nothing showed up." She paused. "What does work on your kind?" "Fire, sunlight, decapitation, sufficiently powerful magic. Not stakes, not stakes." "Well," she tossed the nearest one aside, "that's 10 hours of whittling I'll never get back." He sat up slowly. The world tilted, righted itself. He was depleted, his body running on nothing, his healing sluggish, his senses muffled. 14 days without blood. The torpor had stabilized him, but he was still profoundly weak. She watched him with professional assessment, her healer's eye cataloging the hollowed cheekbones, the way his movements lacked their usual fluid precision. Then she looked at his face, and her expression shifted. "You need blood," she said. "Not a question." He said nothing. The hunger was there, a low, insistent pull behind his sternum, the ancient need that never fully went away. Weakened as he was, it was louder than anything, a frequency he couldn't tune out. He could hear her heartbeat, rich and strong, and his body leaned toward it before his mind could object. He pulled back. I have stores in the cellars. I will manage. You look like you might not manage. I have survived worse. You keep saying that as if it's reassuring. It isn't. She reached for her herb knife, the small, sharp blade she carried everywhere, and held out her wrist. A healer knows how much can be given safely. I've been calculating blood volume ratios since I was 16. No. The word came out harder than he intended. Your life is not a cure for mine, Maya. She held his gaze. Her wrist didn't waver. It's not a cure, it's a meal. You've been starving yourself for 2 weeks because you're too proud and too scared to sit in a room with a woman who loves you and admit that you're terrified. I am offering you something freely. If you refuse because of some ancient noble idiot code about protecting me from yourself, I will be offended. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the library. A small amount, he said finally, and you tell me the moment you feel lightheaded. Obviously. She moved closer, offered her wrist. He took it in both hands gently, with the reverent care of someone handling something infinitely precious, and brought it to his lips. The bite was quick and precise. Her blood was warm, alive, and tasted of her sage and sunlight, and the iron-bright vitality of a life lived with purpose. The hunger quieted. His strength began to return, not fully, not yet, but enough that the world stopped tilting and his hands stopped trembling. He drank only for a few seconds, then sealed the bite with a press of his thumb, the skin closing under his touch. She looked at the 2 small marks on her wrist. That's it? That is sufficient. Huh. She turned her wrist in the lamplight. I expected it to hurt more. It mostly just felt warm. She paused. Is it always like that? No, he said. It is not always like that. And he would not tell her what it meant, that it had felt like that. Not yet. Color was returning to his face. His movements were steadier. She watched him with the clinical satisfaction of a healer watching treatment work. Now, she said with the brisk tone of someone moving through a checklist, you are going to go to the cellars and drink from your stores until you are fully recovered. And then you are going to come back here and have a conversation with me like an adult instead of a 1,000-year-old child throwing a tantrum. He looked at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of his library, blood drying on her wrist, issuing directives to a vampire king who had just tried to end their relationship and been foiled by his own biology. As you wish, he said. He went. He fed properly, thoroughly, standing alone in the cold cellar with his hands shaking, drinking until the hollowness filled and his senses sharpened and the world came back into focus. When he returned to the library, she was still there, sitting in the armchair that had become hers, her legs tucked beneath her, the shattered inkwell still staining the far wall. Better? She asked. Better. Good, sit down. He sat. She looked at him long, steady, the diagnostic gaze giving way to something raw. Now tell me, she said quietly, without the running away, without the noble sacrifice, tell me what you're actually afraid of. He looked at her, at the silver thread in her hair, at the fine lines at her eyes, at the pulse beating in her throat, strong, alive, counting down a timeline he couldn't share. I will outlive you, he said, by centuries, possibly millennia. You will grow old, your hair will go white, your joints will ache in the cold, and I will look exactly as I look now, unchanged. While you... He stopped. His hand, resting on the arm of the chair, was gripping the wood hard enough to creak. While I what? She asked softly. She wasn't flinching. While you leave me. The words came out raw, not by choice, by time, and I will have to watch. Every day, every year, I will have to watch you become a memory. I. The silence between them was vast. How long have you been carrying that? She asked. Since the night you told me my song was sad. She exhaled, a long, slow breath. Then she did what she always did. When emotion threatened to overwhelm her, she reached for the practical, the real, the thing she could hold. She took his cold hand in both of hers. She turned it over. She traced the lines on his palm lines that hadn't changed since the day he died and was remade. "This hand," she said quietly, "has looked exactly like this for 1,000 years. Yes. And mine will not." She held up her own hand beside his. Her fingers were shorter, rougher, browned from sun and stained from herbs. There was a small scar on her thumb from a childhood accident. Her knuckles would thicken with age. The veins would rise. The skin would thin and spot. "That's what you're looking at, isn't it? When you go quiet, when you watch me sleep, you're watching me age." He couldn't speak. His throat had closed around something that was either a word or a sound he hadn't made since the century he was born in. "Nikolai." Her voice was firm now, the healer's voice, the one that brooked no argument. "I'm a healer. I've sat with people as they died. I've held their hands while the light went out of their eyes. I know what mortality means, not as a concept, but as a physical event that happens in a specific room, at a specific hour. I knew the math of us since the night I felt no pulse in your wrist and decided I didn't care." She held his gaze. Her heartbeat was steady, 80 beats per minute, not afraid, not uncertain. "You don't get to decide what I am strong enough to face. You don't get to grieve me while I'm still here. The question isn't whether we'll lose each other. Everything alive loses everything eventually. The question is whether the time we have is worth the grief of losing it." "Is it?" he asked. And he heard, in his own voice, 1,000 years of loneliness asking to be answered. "Every second of it," she said. "Every single one. And if you spend those seconds watching me like I'm already a memory, I will be very angry with you. And you know what I'm like when I'm angry. You throw pottery." "I throw pottery," she confirmed. And then she was laughing and crying and pulling him forward by the front of his shirt and kissing him, her warm mouth against his cold one. Her heartbeat hammering now, 120. Alive, 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 and he kissed her back with the careful, devastating precision of someone who had waited 1,000 years to do exactly this and was terrified of getting it wrong. He found her a week later in her garden. The autumn sun was warm and low, and her plants were reaching for it with the stubborn optimism of living things that refused to acknowledge the coming frost. She was on her knees in the dirt, negotiating with the chamomile, which apparently had opinions about drainage. He stood for a long time, watching her. He could smell the turned earth, the green of growing things, the warmth of sunlight that he had to stand just outside of, in the shade of the cottage. She was in light. He was in shadow. The metaphor was on the nose, and he refused to acknowledge it. "Maya." She looked up. Dirt on her cheek, always dirt on her cheek. She smiled. "Nikolai, you look less catastrophic than last time." He walked to the edge of the herb bed and knelt, mirroring her. He was in her world now, on her terms. "I have ruled for 1,000 years," he began, his voice steady. "I have commanded armies, built empires, and watched them fall. I believed I was meant to be alone, to be feared." He took her hand. His cold fingers closed around hers, dirt and all. He could feel her heartbeat through her palm, 92 now, quick and expectant. "I am not offering you a crown," he said. "I am not offering you immortality. Not unless that is a path you freely choose, for your own reasons, in your own time. I am offering you my truth, my loyalty, my life, which is long and strange and will be entirely different with you in it. I am asking you to stand with me, not behind me. To face whatever comes, the shadows, the politics, the fact that I cannot find the sugar bowl together." She was crying. Not dramatically the quiet, steady tears of someone who is not surprised by what they feel, only by hearing it said aloud. Her hands were covered in dirt. Her braid was coming undone. She had never looked more beautiful to him, and he had seen 10 centuries of beauty. "I already was," she whispered, "and you were already mine." He pulled her to her feet and drew her into his arms, right there in the garden, half in shadow and half in light. She was warm. She was alive. Her heart beat against his silent chest, a sound that would one day stop, and he held her anyway, fiercely, completely, with the full knowledge of what that would cost him. The sun moved across the garden. He shifted instinctively to keep them in the shade. She noticed. She always noticed. She pressed closer. The conversation happened 3 weeks later, in the library, on a night when rain hammered the windows and the fire burned low. He had been reading a treatise on blood magic not for the first time, but with a new and desperate attention, searching for something he could not yet name. She was curled in her armchair with a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. He could tell by the way she was holding the cup, both hands wrapped around it, not drinking, just holding, that she had been working up to something. Nikolai. Yes, we need to talk about turning. He went still. Not the performative kind. The real kind, no breath, no movement. The absolute zero of a vampire who has heard the thing he's been dreading. I've been thinking about it, she said. And her voice was steady, but her heartbeat was not. 95. 100. I know it's the obvious answer. You turn me, we have forever. The gap closes. Simple. It is not simple. No, it isn't. She set the cold tea down and looked at him directly. I'm a healer, Nikolai. I have spent my entire life learning how to sustain life, how to coax a fever down, how to set a bone, how to hold a dying person's hand and help their body do what bodies do. Everything I am, everything I know is built on understanding how living things work. She paused. Her hands, in her lap, were very still, a conscious effort, he could see. She was holding herself together with discipline. A vampire survives on blood, on taking from others to sustain yourself. I don't judge you for it. It's your nature, and you carry it with more grace and restraint than anyone could ask. But I cannot become that. I can't spend eternity needing to take what I've spent my whole life learning to give. It would hollow me out. The thing you love about me, the healer, the woman who sits with the dying, the one who grows things that woman cannot exist inside the body you're describing. The silence was enormous. He could hear the rain, the fire, the particular quality of quiet that fills a room when something true has been said. I know, he said. And he did. He had known it before she said it had known, with the bone-deep intuition of someone who had spent months memorizing every dimension of her, that this was the one thing he could never ask. To turn Maya would be to kill the part of her that made her Maya. Then we live with the gap, she said. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes were bright. We love within it, the way we said we would. Yes, he said. But that night after she had fallen asleep in the armchair and he had carried her to the guest chamber, noting, as he always did, the warmth of her against his cold chest, the fragile architecture of her breathing, he returned to the library. He stood at the window for a long time, watching the rain. Then he began to search. He found it on the 11th night. Not in the grand volumes or the important texts, the ones bound in tooled leather with gilt lettering. He found it in a scroll so old it crumbled at the edges when he unrolled it, written in a dialect so ancient he had to translate it 3 times to be sure he wasn't deceiving himself. The Rite of the Mortal Bond. The text was sparse and clinical, written by a vampire scholar who clearly considered the subject a curiosity rather than a practical concern. The mechanism was simple, in the way that only the most profound things are simple. A vampire of sufficient age, bound by genuine love to a mortal, could choose to tether his existence to his beloved's lifespan, not a turning, not a transformation, a binding. The vampire would remain exactly what he was, cold, deathless, unchanged by time, but his existence would be knotted to hers. Her heartbeat would become the thread that held him in the world. And when that thread stopped, when her heart beat its last, he would end. Not slowly, not by aging or decay. The text used a word that translated roughly as unraveling. The body would come apart, dust and silence, in the same breath as her last. The cost was absolute. There was no reversal. The vampire would not become mortal, he would remain what he was, with all its weight and hunger and cold. He would watch his beloved age while he did not. He would hold her with hands that never changed while hers grew thin and spotted. And then, at the end, he would follow her into nothing. The text noted, with dry scholarly detachment, that the rite had been performed only 3 times in recorded history, because the requirement was disqualifying for most. The love had to be true. Not passionate, not obsessive, not the hungry possessiveness that vampires often mistook for devotion. True. The kind that would choose the beloved's happiness over its own survival. The kind that would walk into sunlight if the alternative was an eternity without her. The scroll did not use the word sacrifice. It used a word that translated roughly as completion. Nikolai read it 7 times. Then he sat in the dark for 3 hours, not breathing, not moving, listening to the distant sound of Maya's heartbeat through 2 walls and a corridor 62 beats per minute, steady and asleep, and he thought about 1,000 years of solitude and 1,000 more stretching out before him. And he thought about how he had once watched a moth on his knee because he had nothing better to do. And he thought about stew and clay pots and a struggling rosemary bush being lectured about drainage, and a pair of warm hands that had never once trembled while stitching his wound, and a voice that had said, "You must have been so lonely," when he had offered her every reason to run. The decision was not difficult. It was, in fact, the easiest thing he had ever done. He told her in the garden. It seemed right her territory, her domain, the place where she had always been most herself. She was pruning the rosemary when he knelt beside her and placed the ancient scroll on the ground between them. She looked at it, then at him, and her hands went still. "What is this?" "A way," he said. "Not your way, mine." She read it. Slowly, carefully, the way she read everything with the methodical attention of someone who needed to understand every word before she could trust the whole. He watched her face. He watched the comprehension arrive not all at once, but in stages, like dawn. "This is," she stopped, read it again, looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Naked, unguarded hope, fighting against the terror of believing it. "Nikolai, this says you would die when I die." "Yes. But you'd still be, you wouldn't become. I would remain exactly what I am. Cold, unchanged, everything you already know." He paused. "But my existence would be bound to yours. Your heartbeat would hold me in the world. And when it stops, I would end, in the same moment, dust and silence." She stared at him. "You would watch me grow old, looking exactly as you look now." "Yes. And then you would disintegrate." "Yes. Nikolai, that is what I want." He took her hands, dirt and all, as always. "I have lived 1,000 years. I have seen empires and ages and the full catalogue of what immortality offers. And I am telling you, with the clarity of someone who has had a very, very long time to think about it, none of it was worth the sound of your heartbeat. I would rather have 50 years tethered to you than an eternity without you." She was shaking, not with fear, with the effort of containing something too large for her body. Her heartbeat was wild, 140, 150, and her eyes were streaming, and her hands gripped his with a fierceness that would have been painful if he'd been anything less than what he was. "You can't give up 1,000 years for me." "I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing something. For the first time in my existence, I am choosing the thing I actually want. The court, your kingdom. I have already spoken to Vasek. The throne passes to him formally at the next court. He has been running the kingdom in all but name for decades. He just lacked the title. And the eastern provinces will argue about Clause 7, regardless of who sits on the throne." He paused. "Maya, I sat on those steps for 3 centuries because I had nothing worth standing up for. You are the reason I stood up." She was crying. Full, unguarded crying, the kind she never did, the kind she kept locked behind the professional composure and the practical hands and the steady voice. She cried the way she did everything, completely, without pretense, with her whole self. "The scroll says the love has to be true," she managed. "How do you know?" I starved myself for 14 days because I would rather have died than watched you grow old. You walked 4 hours in the dark to throw an inkwell at my head. I think we qualify." She laughed. It was half a sob, wrecked and beautiful, and she pulled him forward by the front of his shirt, the same gesture, the same ferocity, and kissed him for the second time. This time it tasted like salt and dirt and the specific, overwhelming joy of two people who had been carrying an impossible weight and had just set it down. They performed the rite at midnight, in the clearing where she had once fed him from her wrist. The moon was full and the forest was alive with sound owls, insects, the distant movement of deer. Maya drew the circle with rowan ash and silver dust, the same materials her grandmother had taught her to use for the deepest workings. Nikolai stood at the center, and for the first time in 1,000 years, he was afraid in a way that mattered not of pain, not of enemies, but of the vast and terrifying possibility of happiness. She made a small cut in his palm with her herb knife. His dark blood welled up. She pressed her own palm against his, her warm blood mingling with his cold, and spoke the words from the scroll in a voice that shook but did not break. The change was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no thunderclap, no cosmic announcement that a 1,000-year-old king had just chosen to end. What happened was quieter and more profound. He felt something settle into place, not in his chest, where silence still lived, but deeper, in the architecture of what he was, a thread, a tether. Thin and unbreakable, connecting his existence to the woman standing in front of him. He could feel her heartbeat. Not hear it, he had always been able to hear it. Feel it, as if it were his own, as if the steady rhythm of her pulse had become the metronome that kept him in the world. His chest was still silent. His skin was still cold. He did not breathe. Nothing about him had changed, not his strength, not his hunger, not the ancient, predatory stillness that lived in his bones. He was still exactly what he had always been. Except now, he had an ending. And his ending was her. Maya pressed her hand to his cheek-warm palm against cold skin, the same contrast as always, and studied his face with her healer's eyes. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it. He thought about the silence in his chest unchanged, familiar. He thought about the thread he could feel now, connecting him to her pulse, a warmth that was not physical but absolute. He thought about the fact that when her heart stopped in 30 years or 50, or, if fate was generous, more he would come apart. Dust and silence, in the same breath. He would not have to endure eternity without her. He would not have to watch her become a memory. He would simply end, and they would end together. "I feel," he said, "like a man who has just been given the most extraordinary gift anyone has ever received." She waited. She knew him well enough to know there was more. "I also feel," he said, "like I want stew." Her face broke open into a smile so wide it transformed everything: the clearing, the moonlight, the ancient forest, the whole improbable night. She laughed, and the sound was the same sound that had haunted his library and his fortress and his cold, immortal heart for months, and he heard it now with a fierce, possessive gratitude, because he would hear it for exactly as long as she lived, and not a single moment longer, and that was enough. "I have stew at home," she said. "Of course you do." She pulled him to his feet. They walked out of the forest together, him in shadow, her in moonlight, as they had always been, as they would always be. His hand was cold in her warm one. His chest was silent beside her beating heart. Nothing had changed and everything had changed. For the first time, neither of them was counting. Their kingdom was not one of fear. Their reign was not one of solitude. It was a domain of two built on the impossible, sustained by the specific, grounded love of a mortal woman who threw inkwells at vampire kings, and a vampire king who had chosen, freely and without regret, to tie his eternity to her finite, extraordinary life. In the garden behind her cottage, the chamomile had finally agreed to cooperate. The rosemary was thriving. The ginger cat had claimed the sunniest windowsill and showed no signs of relinquishing it. And on warm afternoons, a woman with dirt on her cheek and a chaotic braid grayer now The silver threads multiplying with each passing year would kneel in the herbs, while a man with dark hair and unchanged eyes watched from the shade of the cottage wall. He could not sit in the sunlight. He never would, but he sat as close to it as he could, in the long shadow of the eaves, because that was where she was. She looked up and caught him watching. "You're doing the staring thing again. I am admiring. You're brooding. You have a very specific brooding face, and this is it." "I do not brood. I contemplate." "You contemplate broodingly." She set down her trowel and reached for his hand. He gave it. She held it, her warm fingers wrapped around his cold ones. The old contrast that had become the most familiar sensation in both their lives. "What are you contemplating?" He looked at her hand in his, at the small scars on her fingers from years of herb work, at the new lines on her knuckles that hadn't been there last year, at the 2 faint marks on her wrist, long since faded to pale crescents, a geography that belonged to a night in a library that neither of them would ever forget. Her hands were changing, his were not. They never would. He did not flinch. He did not look away. "I am contemplating," he said, "that I still cannot find the sugar bowl. That's because I moved it. I know you moved it. You move it every week. It is a campaign of domestic terrorism. It keeps you sharp." She squeezed his hand. "Also, you put it in the wrong cabinet. Every time. For months. The sugar bowl lives above the stove. I don't make the rules. You exclusively make the rules." She grinned, the real one, the one that made the corners of her eyes crinkle, the lines deeper now than when he'd first seen them, and more beautiful for it. Every line was a year he'd been given. Every crease was a day he would not have to spend alone. "Come inside," she said. "There's stew." He stood too fast, too fluid, the inhuman grace he would never lose. She noticed. She always noticed. She didn't mind. She had stopped minding a long time ago. "I love you," he said, because after 1,000 years of silence, he had learned that some words should not be hoarded. "I know," she said. "You chose me over eternity." It was a fairly clear signal. He followed her inside, stepping out of the fading light and into the warmth of the cottage. The herbs hung from the rafters. The ginger cat occupied the mantelpiece with the proprietary confidence of a creature who had never questioned his place in the world. The fire crackled. The stew simmered. Everything smelled of sage and home. He sat in the chair by the hearth, his chair, the one with the dents in the arms from the night he'd gripped it too hard. The dents were still there. His hands could still make new ones. He was careful not to. Maya set a bowl of stew before him. He ate it slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite the way he savored everything now. Food was not sustenance for him. It never would be. But it was hers, and eating it was a small act of communion, a way of participating in her mortal, living world. It was, as always, unreasonably good. "More?" she asked. "Please." She refilled his bowl, and her hand brushed his shoulder as she passed, and he felt it, not just the warmth of her skin, but the thread, the tether, the invisible bond that connected his existence to her heartbeat. 64 beats per minute, strong and steady and unhurried. He could hear it the way he had always heard it, with supernatural precision, from across the room, through walls, through silence. He would hear it for the rest of her life, and when it stopped, he would stop too, not in grief, not in the long, grinding centuries of loss he had once dreaded, in the same breath, the same moment. He would come apart, dust and silence, the way the scroll had described, and there would be no eternity without her. That was the gift, not that he would live, that he would not have to live without her. He looked across the table at the woman who had saved him. Her hair was silver at the temples. Her laugh lines were deeper. Her hands resting on the table were a little thinner than they'd been the year before. She was changing, and he was not. And he watched her change with the same expression he had worn since the night she told him his song was sad, not grief, not fear, but the fierce, unwavering attention of someone who understood that every moment was borrowed and every single one was worth the borrowing. She caught him looking. Still staring, still admiring, brooding, contemplating, he corrected. Broodingly, she laughed. Then she was quiet for a moment, her hand still holding his warm fingers wrapped around cold ones, the old geography unchanged. Nikolai. Yes. Do you ever regret it? He knew what she meant. The right, the tether, the decision to trade eternity for whatever remained of her life 30 years or 20 or 10. The knowledge that when her heart stopped, he would come apart like ash in wind. I regret every night I spent in that fortress before I knew you, he said. I regret every century I wasted believing I was meant to be alone. I regret the 14 days I spent starving myself instead of sitting in this kitchen. He paused. I do not regret the right. I will not regret it when I am dust. It will be the last thing I feel not regret, gratitude, that I had this, that I had you. She squeezed his hand. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't cry. She had stopped crying about it years ago, when the gratitude had outweighed the grief. You're doing the speech thing again, she said. I do not make speeches. I make observations, at length. You make speeches, brooding, dramatic speeches, with pauses. The pauses are for emphasis. The pauses are because you're a 1,000-year-old drama queen who discovered feelings and never learned to use them at a reasonable volume. He looked at her, this woman with silver hair and dirt on her cheek and a laugh that could fill a castle, who had checked his pulse on the third visit and found nothing and loved him anyway, who had planted moonflowers in her garden so something beautiful would bloom in the dark, who had thrown an inkwell at his head and fed him from her wrist and told him his song was sad, and he felt the thread between them hum, quiet and sure, the tether that held him in the world. Outside, the sun was setting. Inside, the fire burned. Her heartbeat was steady in his ears, 64, 64, 64, and he was still here, and she was still here, and the stew was still unreasonably good, and the sugar bowl was in the wrong cabinet again, and the ginger cat had opinions about the seating arrangements, and it was ordinary and temporary and theirs. It was everything.